And good morning, everybody. We are live. No technical issues. Knock on something there. There we go. Good morning. You made it through the week. So proud of what you do. My name is Bryan Armentrout with the Food Leadership Group. And if you are new here to the Food Safety Chat, welcome. Pull up a chair. We're going to spend an hour talking about all things food safety. And every week, if you're new to the show, I bring a special guest on. And this week, my guest is Dr. Douglas Marshall with Eurofins. Doug, how you doing today?
Fantastic, Brian. Nice sunny day where we live, so couldn't be any worse.
Absolutely. On this Friday the 13th in October, believe it or not. And what's kind of cool too, Doug, I was looking through the information on the chats here today, and this is episode number 150. Congratulations. I will send you a complimentary let's see, container of eye drops just as a special prize for being that guest on the show. So congratulations.
My eyes are honored. Thank you, Brian.
So with the chat, what we do here is, number one, first thing you're going to notice is this is not a presentation. This is an opportunity to talk with an expert and get the lowdown on a particular topic and ask your questions. And that's always the fun part. So we encourage greatly to, I always get my arrows wrong. So on my screen, I've got my chat over here on the side. Put your questions in and let us know what you're thinking. One of the things that we love to do here on the chat as well is we put in where in the world you're at. I'm in beautiful, as Doug had referenced, Loveland, Colorado. And Doug, not too far away. Where are you at, sir?
I'm in Fort Collins.
Which, if you know Doug at all, is a rare thing. This dude travels constantly. So whenever I am fortunate enough to get Dr. Marshall on the show, it is a rare treat. So put your seatbelts on. So Kara, good morning. Nice to see you. Oh, rainy in Wisconsin. Yeah, it was supposed to be kind of rainy here, but didn't really materialize here at my house. A little disappointing. Birmingham, Alabama, very nice city. Been there myself. So yeah, it's kind of a weird off the wall question. How many states have you been to, Doug?
All 50 and a few U.S. territories.
Oh, nice. You got me beat. I've been to every state except for Alaska. Saving the best for last, probably. Claire, nice to see you in Oklahoma. Boy, I was surprised the last time I went through Oklahoma City, how big that city has gotten. Holy moly, huge. But with that, one of the things that we do here on the chat, everyone, is especially nice on a morning like this, is join us for a drink of your favorite beverage. I have coffee. What you got this morning, Doug? Looks like a little vodka. Nice.
Well, yeah, a little aqua vitae.
Cheers, everyone. Ryan in Wisconsin as well. Looks like he's getting some rain there too. So, gosh, this topic is huge. And so if you can't tell, if you're new to the chat, we're definitely kind of speeding up the introduction here to get to the main topic, which is sanitation. And one of the things with sanitation, and I'm sure you see this a lot, and this is where Doug's expertise comes in really, really well. If you worked with Doug at all, and he doesn't like praise, so I'll keep it to a minimum here, is one of the advantages with working with Eurofins is that you sometimes get asked Doug some questions. And Doug isn't like most PhD academics. He is real world. He gets out there and he works with clients and he actually helps them. He doesn't send you an article to read or you maybe get him by email or things like this. Doug is a hands-on guy, and that's something I appreciate greatly, Doug, in what you do. So here on the forum, I wanted to thank you for that.
I appreciate it, Brian.
You bet. Morning, Tim. Nice to see you. So sanitation, Doug, is kind of one of those things that gets, it's like shoved off in the corner. It's like, okay, we'll run production and we'll do sanitation at night and maybe things get cleaned. And oh, by the way, next year we need to cut sanitation time. And it's a cost to the organization. So a lot of times sanitation gets overlooked, which is too bad because it's an extremely important function. And generally the way I think about sanitation is kind of two main categories, wet and dry cleaning. Does that make sense to you as well?
Yeah, it does. And just to further emphasize the importance of this topic today, when you look at warning letters and 483s and recalls and
Mm,
lawsuits, most of the time FDA is going to use the term manufactured under insanitary conditions as justification for their action against a company. So, we spend a lot of time on process preventive controls, but if you don't get your GMPs and your sanitation right, these microbes can get around your preventive controls with some ease.
absolutely. And yeah, that's a very good point. It's one of the things that they dive into almost immediately. And you'll also know that you're in serious trouble in these type of situations if they start looking at your emails, right? So make sure you have good archive policies in place relative to those. Ask the former CEO at Bluebell how important that is. His whole case was based upon his emails, but I digress. So with wet versus dry cleaning, I'm sorry, go ahead, Doug.
No, no, go ahead. Back to your question. Sorry, I
Back to
diverted a bit.
so I mean, so wet and dry are, I mean, two kind of general big categories, and most of us, I wouldn't know a percentage relative to this, but it seems like most operations fall into the wet category. But what we're going to focus on the dry side of things here today. So what are some good examples of products that fall into the dry cleaning category?
Yeah, it could be a diverse group of products, but usually when I think of facilities that rely solely on dry cleaning, usually you're thinking about dry grain and oil seed manufacturers, things like flour, pasta manufacturers. Although
Oh,
the pasta is typically wet, usually they will rely on dry cleaning because it's so difficult to get pasta off of complicated equipment.
mm,
And so again, millers, flour manufacturers, blenders who are doing blending of dry ingredients to make an additional product. So these could be baking blenders, they could be spice blenders. So those would be a lot of the facilities that I would see that are dry clean only. And then you also have facilities that may have a wet side of the process and then a dry side of the process.
mm.
So one side of the process, they might be doing wet cleaning and sanitation. The other side, they may be doing dry cleaning and sanitation.
Yeah, that's a
So,
really good point.
so that's how I would kind of differentiate from those that do have a hard sanitation break where they simply wash down all the equipment to remove the soils, then apply a wet sanitizer, oxidizing sanitizer to kill microbes.
Yeah, that's a good point because a lot of times, so with wet sanitation, generally you have very clear what I like to call bookends. So you have a CIP process, you wash all your equipment, you foam it down, you rinse it, you sanitize, you do verification testing, ATP, allergen rinse testing, what have you, to make sure everything is clean. And so if FDA has an issue with a particular production run, you can block those things off pretty quickly. But it's not that clear with dry cleaning because a lot of times, and in my mind, Doug, I have this picture of like a vacuum cleaner, right? Like a shop vac. They're out there in the plant with the vacuum cleaner, kind of cleaning dust off of equipment, but they're never going to get everything that way, right?
Yeah, there's a couple of other considerations too. Number one, as you pointed out, it's really hard to dry clean anything.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about dry cleaning your silk shirt. We're talking about dry cleaning a dirty manufacturing facility.
Yeah.
So to be able to get all the organic material off of equipment, off of floors, off of walls, off of ceilings is extremely difficult to do. The second thing is a lot of these facilities have I'll call it a sanitation regularity that's far different than a wet operation, meaning you may only dry clean once a week, once a month. There are
Ah,
some facilities that might only do it once a year.
wow.
So all of that soil that builds up over this periodicity just makes it challenging to clean. And then the corollary here is if you can't get a surface clean, it's next to impossible to get it sanitary.
Right.
So that's the big challenge that dry operations have is number one, deciding how do we clean the soils off of equipment, particularly food contact surfaces, and then what do we do to sanitize those surfaces? And the risk is if you add water to these systems, now you're providing microorganisms one of three things they need to multiply and grow. So the first one are soils, so organic materials. So in a dry clean operation, you have an abundance of those everywhere in the facility. Second thing you need is the right temperature. And so for human pathogens, it's anywhere from ambient temperature to a little warmer, um, where they can multiply and grow. Some can grow at low temperatures as well. And then the third thing that is absent from this formula in a dry facility is water.
Yeah.
Once you add water, if you don't get rid of the microorganisms, now you get what we call a salmonella bloom, meaning if you've got salmonella in that environment, now you're giving it an opportunity to multiply and grow, and gaining back control can be very challenging.
Right. And yeah, people who have dry cleaning operations aren't doing it as an option, right? They do it because it's the only way that they can clean. So to your point, like Ryan is saying here, when you introduce water into that, you just think about it at home, right? If you're making a cake and you add some water to a bowl of flour, right, you end up with this wet, sloppy goo that's really hard. Now you've just made the problem incredibly difficult. So number one, as you had stated as well, with the bookends on your dry cleaning process, because of how that is set up, you're going to have much wider windows. And there may be a point in time if you have a dry operation, and let's say twice a year or things like this, where you shut down the whole plant, and you may go in there and do more intensive cleaning to try and bookend those processes. Because the last thing you want is to just continue this on forever, because then your exposure continues with that as well. So let's say, for example, that you had an unknown allergen or something that was in a dry ingredient that you didn't know. Now, if FDA comes in for an investigation, you're going to have to recall all that stuff because there's no breakages associated with that.
Yeah, exactly. The other concern that I think I spend most of my time on in dry facilities is water intrusion events.
Mm.
So you could have a rain event, so water could come in through the walls, through the floors, through the roof, or you have a pipe leak where you are spritzing water or pouring water into that environment. And under those scenarios, many of these dry clean facilities don't have a plan of action. So they wind up taking a series of actions that actually make the situation worse. And it extends the amount of time it takes for them to remediate a facility.
Yeah, and a lot of times, if you are designing a dry facility from scratch, let's say that you're a large manufacturer and you're producing flour or something like this, you're not going to be in some instances putting drains in because there's no need for drains. And now all of a sudden, as you had mentioned, one of these instances happens. So let's say that, yeah, there's a flood and water goes through and goes into the plant. It has nowhere to go. And it just becomes an absolute nightmare. And I think this is why a lot of times too, because with dry materials, number one, right, you have these large windows of manufacturing between serious cleanup activities, systemic cleanup within the process versus the vacuuming example and things like this, you tend to have recalls that are very large. And one of the reasons for this as well is if you're producing dry products, so flours, whey proteins, things of this nature, extremely intensive, lots of energy, lots of activity. Think about a spray dryer and the amount of energy it takes to get that sucker up and running. You don't want to shut it down because of that thermal mass that you have with that. Just getting it up to operating temperature is extremely expensive. So when these type of events happen, you tend to have very large recalls. And recently, Doug, the one that comes to mind for me is gold medal flour. Gigantic recall with these guys.
Yeah, the other consideration too, a lot of these facilities, the equipment that they use are very old. They were
Mm.
never constructed to sanitary design. They're incredibly burdensome to break down to actually do any reasonable cleaning. And that usually is an excuse for why we're only doing this once a month or once a year. Is just because it's extremely challenging to really break that equipment down and get it clean. The other thing is a lot of this equipment is very, very large,
Yeah.
and I mean very large.
Yeah.
And so just the physical act of getting access to even do an inspection of some of that equipment is very challenging.
Yeah, and not to mention now you've got safety issues as well because you have gigantic dryers and things of this nature, confined spaces. Now you have to have special equipment to go into these areas. All of these type of things contribute to just how difficult it is. And with this gold medal flower recall, as I was looking this thing up, so we've got two main areas where we have risks: salmonella, as we've been talking about, and also E. coli, and even S. tech and other hemorrhagic versions of that as well, which make it even worse. But that gold medal recall, Doug, it was only 2 days of production, which is pretty surprising that they were able to limit it to that. But it was still 2 million pounds in 2 days of production. It's just like, holy moly. I mean, these guys are just making incredible amounts of product when they're running.
Yeah, and these commodity manufacturers, they are literally getting in, you know, train loads worth of raw material that then get put into gigantic silos and then put into process. And of course, the problem is you've got so let's just focus on salmonella for now.
Yeah.
You've got a salmonella contamination rate of that crop that might be 1 to 3%. So if you're one of those manufacturers, you should know that that material is not free of pathogens. And since you don't have, well, most of the time you don't have a kill step in the process, um, that microorganism is going to carry through into the final product.
Mhm.
And so think about what your intended and unintended use of that product is for your customers. And are they using it in an application where there is no kill step in the process?
Right.
So, there's a lot of potential inherent risk associated with this product category with preventive controls that might not be very good.
Right. Yeah. So think like with this flour example. So gold medal is sending industrial flour that they manufacture to other manufacturers who are now dry blending it into cake mixes or corn muffin mix or what have you. You've got your mom who is going to the grocery store and buying a 1 pound bag and then taking it home, and it stays in the cupboard for a long time as she's making cake for Thanksgiving as it's coming up and things like this. And so these recall windows tend to be very long and very difficult to control as well. Um, that's part of the unique issues with salmonella is, man, that sucker's hardy, right? It can survive some pretty amazing circumstances and just hang out, right? It'll just hang out and wait for the right environment. And to your point earlier, right? Once you introduce that water, it's got enough available nutrients, man, it's off to the races. And here's something that absolutely just blows my mind on salmonella as well is quorum sensing. So with a lot of bacteria, right, it's that initial dosage that's going to make you sick. So if you get a lot of bacteria in your gut, it's going to make you sick pretty quick. What's really weird about salmonella is it has evolved to it knows how many of their fellow salmonella are hanging out in your gut. And if there's not enough to attack you, they'll just hang out and they'll wait for enough. And then they'll send a signal to the rest of the salmonella and say, okay, guys, we got enough troops now. Let's attack. So your immune system isn't even aware it's there until that salmonella grows enough. So even that initial low dosage that you may be getting from that flour of actual organisms are making it through can still be a threat on that side as well. It's crazy.
Mhm. Yeah. Another product category I think is interesting because of just the risk in the manufacturing is we've seen an explosion of what I'll call nutrition bars.
Mm,
And these nutrition bars typically do not have a kill step during the manufacturing process. So you just get usually commodity ingredients that are mixed with some inherent material, let's say honey or some sugar syrup, and then pressed into a sheet. And then bars are individually cut, they're wrapped. I mean, it's all a dry process.
yeah.
But imagine what the risk might be in that product category. The good thing is there's no water, there's no growth for salmonella, but there still could be salmonella in those ingredients and in that manufacturing environment. There also could be unintended allergens or intended allergens that need to be removed during cleaning operations when you switch over from one SKU to another SKU.
Yeah. Oh, and that's a very good point. And so with your dry cleaning operation, if you're going through there and doing a vacuum clean, dusting and doing things of this nature, um, the actual trigger levels associated with allergens very low, right? So you're talking 5 parts per million in some cases, 10 parts per million in others, and also the varying levels of reactions that people have to those. So a piece of equipment may look clean after you go through and you kind of clean it off, but once you run that allergen test, it's actually not.
Yeah, and remember too that the limit of detection for an allergen test can be a bigger number than the intoxicating dose for high risk individuals. So
Yep,
even though your test result comes back that says you're in spec, you still have a little pinch of that residue there. It could be potentially harmful for that high risk subpopulation.
exactly. And what's interesting on this side as well is home test kits are starting to come out now as well. So I recently had a conversation with a consumer who has a gluten test kit for home. And so they will test products if they're in a restaurant or things of this nature where they're concerned. So if you have someone with a high level of concern, celiac disease and things of this nature. So the consumers are starting to test end product themselves as well. So you could get a nasty surprise on that, thinking you're okay and you're not. Um, so back to your example too with bars and things of this nature, and this is why FDA pays so much attention to ready to eat type products, things that don't have those kill steps, and they're going to pay extra attention to those especially, which then also gets into things where you have minimal preparation as well. Think infant formula. Oh my goodness, right? We had all kinds of problems there.
Yeah, that industry has known about Chronobacter for a long time.
Mhm.
Many of the prudent manufacturers have been testing for Chronobacter. But I think where I find a disconnect, and it's not necessarily just in the powdered formula industry, it's across all industry sectors, is this belief that we should never test product contact surfaces for
Mm,
the harmful agents because we don't want to create a recall situation.
right,
And so you go into facilities, they've got a history of finding out of spec locations that are not food contact surfaces. They go ahead and remediate those locations, but they never ask the question, if it's here, could it not also be on a food contact surface nearby or even far remote from that location? So they wind up doing what they believe is right, but because they're practicing a religion that says we never test product contact surfaces, they wind up in these large recall and these outbreak situations. So
right.
we've had many recent examples of that, of well branded companies just trashing their brand because they had a deficient EMP program.
Yep. And yeah, FDA recently came out with new guidance relative to infant formula. And one of the findings in that document was that FDA investigators had basic training relative to investigating infant formula, but they require much more training. So FDA has recognized that their expertise in this area isn't sufficient. So they're going to be dialing that up. So if you work in this field, you can expect much more activity from FDA.
Yeah, agreed. That's the nice thing about the profession we respectively work in is we think we've got it all figured out, but Mother Nature and the critters she produces are really clever too.
Oh yeah, I when I first got out of college, I worked for a medical device company for a couple of years, and I spent my day in clean rooms. And even there, class 10,000 clean rooms, you were constantly fighting Pseudomonas. So it doesn't matter how clean your environment is, something's going to get in there. So you have to be vigilant all the time. And dry environments will fool you because if you look around, okay, everything looks clean. I think we're okay, but back to the salmonella piece of it, 1.2 million cases is the estimate from CDC annually from salmonella. So it's a significant risk. And getting rid of it when you have it, oh yeah, good luck with that. Because I think in a lot of ways, and I'm curious to get your perspective on this as well, Doug, is it seems like, coming from products, my background is mainly dairy and things of this nature. We had dry products, so whey protein concentrates and things of this nature, but the majority of the business was cheeses and wet cleaning. And that's where it seems like most of the tools and most of the things that we have out there for sanitation fall on the wet side, and the dry side doesn't get a whole lot of attention.
Yeah. So I've witnessed dry cleaning in a number of facilities. And really, we are still at the knuckle dragging Neanderthal stage with dry cleaning. So we have people literally using their hands to scrape off and scoop off adherent material. We
Uh-huh.
may be using scrapers. So here we're back at the early stone tool stage of dry cleaning a food
Oh,
manufacturing site. Um, and then after this cleaning, here's a big thing. I will ask the company that I'm serving. Okay, let's do visual inspection and see how well you did. And you see visual soils on equipment. You say, okay, if I were doing a visual inspection as my first indicator test of cleanliness, I would fail this piece of equipment.
mhm.
And 9 times out of 10, the answer I get is that's the best we can do.
Ooh.
So, I've often pondered that answer. Okay, so can we reclean it and see if we can do better? And sure enough, if you reclean it, you will get more of those soils off. But my favorite example is an interlocking conveyor belt.
Oh,
Okay, and all of the voids and nooks and crannies and hiding places for adherent dry material. Let's say it's I don't know, it just could be whatever. It's really hard to get all of those links clean. And so
yeah.
you do a visual inspection. If they're dirty, re-clean. So those are situations where I would encourage attendees of the webinar today to collect the evidence, present that evidence to upper management, and pitch for a greater budget to recapitalize this facility and install equipment that can be easily dry cleaned because you've got visual evidence that says your cleaning is not effective. So
Right.
why would you continue manufacturing food, particularly if it's a high risk food, using equipment that's not cleanable?
Yeah, and for me, this always kind of comes back to the FDA test. So if you're FDA and you're in my plant doing an inspection, and you ask me that question as the manufacturer, and I say, this is kind of the best we can clean, what's their reaction going to be? Right? It's not going to be, yeah, okay, that's fine. We'll give you a pass. No, not going to happen. And I think a lot of times too, and this is something that is pretty much prevalent in all of food manufacturing, is equipment design. Equipment is designed to produce food as efficiently and fast as it can be manufactured. That's the primary goal, is to have that production line up and running and efficient and producing product and making the company money. Yep, got it. It seems like after the fact, Doug, then the people will come back, people like us who will come back and say, yeah, this new piece of equipment you just installed that you bought off of eBay that was in a field somewhere, I can't clean this. And 9 times out of 10, the response is, to your point, figure it out.
Yeah, and this also bodes for the importance of advanced planning.
Yeah.
So dry, clean only facilities will get in a scenario that we've talked about, right? So
Mhm.
you've got an oops moment. What do you do about it? And so the companies that I have the pleasure of working with, I can't think of a single one that had a plan of attack written, practiced, implemented before the event.
Yeah.
So the oh shit moment happens, and now the turds just start falling out of the sky.
Yeah.
And people are scrambling to try and figure out what to do. So they'll
Mhm.
call up their sanitation chemical supplier if they have one, and they say, what can you do? Sanitation chemical supplier says, I've got this new blue foam that all you have to do is spray down the entire facility and salmonella goes away. Okay, how much and how quickly can you get in? Well, I can be there Friday and it'll be $100,000. Okay, please get your ass in here on Friday and make this problem go away. So that usually is the response and the reaction without actually knowing, number one, will this magic blue foam perform as advertised by the salesperson on the other line? And number two, if the facility is dirty, that blue foam or that sanitizer isn't going to work.
Mm.
So they try that. They get the facility all wet. Salmonella grows. They do their follow-on swabbing. Now they've got salmonella everywhere.
Yeah.
All right, pick up the phone. Whoops, wrong arm. I hear you can do a disinfectant bomb in my facility. How much and how fast can you be here? Yes, we can do a disinfectant bomb. It'll cost you $100,000 and we can be there on Friday. Okay, please get in here. So before you know it, after 2 or 3 weeks, this company has spent a lot of money trying to remediate where they haven't done the one thing they should have done right off the beginning, and that was to clean the damn facility.
Yeah. Right. And if you're an operations guy, back to our gold medal example, and you're producing 1 million pounds of product a day, and that's all going in a warehouse, and it's all on hold because it's suspect for salmonella. Oh man, the bills are adding up really fast. And now, just from a QC QA sampling side, just for fun, go online and plug in a 95% confidence sampling for 1 million pound batch and how many hundreds or thousands of samples you need to pull to determine if that lot is acceptable. Good luck. Good luck with that. Ain't going to happen.
Yeah. So meanwhile, so you've got $2 million worth of inventory. That number grows every day you're not operational or
Mhm.
inventory or lost sales. You spent $200,000 on chemicals that probably aren't going to give you the outcome you expect. So, and you're nowhere near getting remediation of this facility.
Yeah.
The only thing you've done is made it worse.
Mhm.
So, and then you go to upper management and you say, if we would have just replaced that conveyor belt
Right.
2 years ago, this problem would have never occurred.
And I think that's a good point, because that goes to the equipment side of things as well. Is to your point, Doug, which I think is a brilliant one, is that pay me now, pay me later. So invest that money in the equipment up front. And I think a lot of times the equipment on the dry side doesn't get the attention that the wet side does, because you got 3A standards and these type of things where they're looking at these intrusion points. On the dry side of things, they don't necessarily have that rigor with the equipment. It's like, does this need to be made of 304 stainless steel? Nah, it's fine. It's dry. It's not going to rust. It's not even going to get wet. What are we worried about? And you end up with a whole lot of inferior metals and other design flaws within those, that even if, to your example, Doug, if you were to do that, now what are you doing to that equipment? You've increased your salmonella risk, and now you're damaging your equipment as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another thing that might be an oversight in many people's food safety plans is water intrusion events are predictable.
Mm.
They can and do happen. So what does your preventive maintenance plan look like to reduce the odds of that happening in your facility? So, I've gone into many facilities that are chasing salmonella due to a water intrusion event. Okay, it's a roof leak. Well, how long have you known you've had a roof leak? Oh, for the past 10 years.
Mhm.
Okay, what have you been doing about it? Well, it leaks, and then we get somebody in a week later and we patch it, and then we cross our fingers.
Yeah.
So, this preventive maintenance on replacing a roof over the long haul might be a much cheaper solution than chewing bubble gum and going up on the roof and plugging a hole.
Yeah. Well, and part of this too, right? And this is kind of the lesson here with dry cleaning, and Ryan's stating this in here as well too, is that a lot of times on the wet side of things, you get pretty quick feedback on information. The dry side of things is more of a long-term ticking time bomb. So kind of the visual that popped up in my mind as you were giving that example, Doug, is big rainstorm comes, you got a giant puddle of water in the middle of the walkway where all the employees go. Number one, the salmonella that are hanging out in that area are going, awesome. I can start growing now. And it's a dry facility. There's no drain. So that water is just sitting there for a period of time before somebody comes and cleans it up. And the employees are tromping through that giant puddle of water and tracking that nice salmonella to new areas of the plant where it may be dry and then it dries out. And now that salmonella hangs out. And you get this slow march of salmonella through your plant as these events take place and you don't even know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to revisit a comment you made very early on in the conversation, and that was defining what your recall risk is.
Mm.
And so if you're doing infrequent dry cleaning and dry sanitation, you've got to have your hard break evidence that you've done that and your efforts were successful to be able to define for FDA how far back you have to go to recall product. And so I would encourage folks in a dry clean operation to do this math. It's not difficult math to do, but how much would it cost your company to recall or not ship product in the interval that you have with your cleaning breaks?
Mm-hmm.
Because again, that is how much it will cost the company if you have an oops moment.
Yeah.
And then pitch for a budget that doesn't necessarily have to be the same sum total, but pitch for a budget that allows you to do preventive efforts in your facility so that when an oops moment happens, you can reduce that recall risk by whatever behaviors you're doing. So again, that's another, company CEOs, they live and die on the right-hand corner of a spreadsheet.
Right.
And this kind of stuff we're talking about is not evidence on a P&L spreadsheet.
Right.
If it is evident, it's on the cost side of the equation. So I would encourage people, rather than say, we're going to save you money, it's like, no, we're going to protect our revenue. So it's revenue protection activity. So
yeah,
people ought to think about that.
That's a very, very good point. And so part of this, and this is something we talk about on the chat quite a bit, is having all this technical knowledge and expertise is great. But if you're not able to communicate to others in the organization the importance of what you're doing and coming up with financial justifications for it, you're not going to get anywhere. You're just going to end up banging your head against the wall. There was a good point someone made recently on the chat as well, is a lot of times in quality and food safety, one of the things that we're always constantly bucking against is we cost money. And well, how can we reduce costs for these type of expenses and things of this nature? No one ever asks that of the accounting and finance department, do they? Right? Oh, all these accountants and people keeping track of this money, do we really need them? Yeah, we do. Right? It's the same thing. So I remember early in my career, you reminded me of a story on this, Doug, is back when new rapid methods started coming in microbiology. So I was working in a lab and we were doing plating by hand, the old FDA BAM method. I got really good at streaking, and new methodologies were coming out. So the Vitus and other things, with the enzyme linked activities, the ELISA test and these type of things were coming out. And the cost per test on those was significantly higher than the cost of doing it by hand. And so anytime we would talk with management, they're like, no, we can't. No. Keep doing what you're doing. I was finally able to convince upper management doing what you just said. I went to the logistics group and said, hey guys, all these different powders and things that we're testing for salmonella takes a lot of storage space, right? Oh, they're like, oh God, yeah, tons of storage space. Great. How much does it cost to store 100,000 pounds of product, of dry product? Oh, here's the cost for that. And okay, great. If I'm able to reduce that storage time by 60% because I can turn out that test faster, how much will the company save? It was a huge number. I went to my management team, presented that information, and they're like, done.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be able to speak the language that the executives speak in. Because where do CEOs come from? Do they come from what we do? No, right? They come from marketing and sales and finance generally. They don't know. And a lot of times CEOs who are leading a company don't even work in the industry that we work in, right? They come from something else and they come in and they lead a food company. You have to educate them and you have to speak their language. That is so important. If you pull one thing out of the chat today relative to that on how to make things better, it's what Doug just talked about right there. So circling back to looking at your plant. So, okay, it's like, okay, guys, sold, what Bryan and Doug are saying here makes total sense. I need to start going through my dry plant and looking at those different type of risks areas. So I wrote down some areas in plants that, to kind of summarize what we've been talking about here, where you should be looking. So the first one was equipment. And so this is going to depend upon what type of dry process you have. So like our flour examples, you're bringing in grains, you're milling them, you're doing these activities, and the dry product goes out the other side. Okay. Now let's say that you're a baker. You're bringing in these dry ingredients and now you're producing a dough and you're proofing it and you're producing a loaf of bread. So you've got dry stuff and now you've got a wet product in process with the doughs, and then you end up with a baked product at the end. What does your process look like? And with that, you're now looking at this dry versus wet and these type of things for those equipment designs, and going in and doing a deep dive on those pieces of equipment and saying, what are those harborage areas? What are those different things? And to your point earlier, Doug, this is kind of how I can clean. And to your point, I worked in a company where we produced breads and things of this nature. And when you look at some of these pieces of equipment, like, the proofing areas, right? Gigantic proofers, right? Where you've got these giant conveyor belts that are running your loaves of bread through there to proof them. And, the yeast is growing in these type of things. And how do you clean those? And to your point, those plastic belts. We were talking about this last week. All right. Chunk of plastic belt is missing. Where is it? Metal detector's not going to pick that up. Do you have an x-ray? Maybe the x-ray will find it. Maybe it won't. Where is it? Right. That's an embarrassing question. And when you look at a lot of those large bakery equipment lines, conveyor belts everywhere.
Yeah, here's another good example. So you may have a wet side of the process that's early in the process, and then you've got a kill step in the middle, and then you might go through a dry. So let's just take a typical extrusion process. So you make a batter, you extrude it, you get your puffs or your kibbles or whatever. You can even get pasta out of an extruder. And then you might go through a drying process.
Mm-hmm.
So that post-extrusion product exposure, all of those kinds of equipment then probably are subject to dry cleaning and dry sanitation.
Right.
If you don't have a physical barrier between the wet process and the dry process, then all the microbes that are having a wonderful time on the wet side can easily get translocated to the dry side.
Yeah.
So just a wall can be a reasonably good intervention in a scenario like that.
Well, and that side of it too is you may go through and do these design things like we were talking about with the dry facility. Do you have drains? Well, you should probably have drains anyway, even if it is a dry process, because you never know if something's going to happen. What about your sanitation team? Do you have a wet sanitation team and a dry sanitation team, or are those guys going back and forth? So if you got your wet guys with their wet boots and everything else tromping over to the dry side to do stuff, probably not a good idea.
So true. And small facilities where you've got employees that need to work on both sides, what are your personal PPE expectations to go from wet to dry?
Right. And when you're looking at your hazard assessment associated with these things, is your hazards on the dry side are different. So for example, if you are bringing in flours and you're producing baked goods and things of this nature, and you have your dry ingredients, you got to worry about weevils and other things that are going to get in there and eat those products that you don't necessarily worry about for other types of products. So your risk profiles for these different things are going to be different as well. And a lot of times with dry processes, it's a slow moving train wreck, because you go in day after day as the quality guy and you're doing your thing, and behind the scenes, as we were talking about with salmonella, right, where it's slowly spreading in the plant or pests are slowly growing and these type of things, You don't even notice. And then all of a sudden one day you're like, oh crap, right? Now you've got a gigantic problem. It tends to go from I had no idea to a gigantic problem a lot faster than you think.
Well, you bring up a good point. So, okay, you've got salmonella in your facility. How did it get there?
Uh-huh.
And if you take an EMP class, you'll get lots of information on sources of salmonella. But just remember that salmonella, the normal habitat, is the intestinal tract of warm-blooded animals, including the people you employ.
Yeah.
So let's say the odds are maybe 10%. So if you have 10 employees, one of those on any given day might be bringing salmonella in because they're an asymptomatic carrier.
Yeah.
Or they worked that morning taking the dog out for a walk and a poo, or they've got a small family farm where they milk the goats or the sheep. So you just think about salmonella has abundant opportunity to gain access to a closed facility. By far and away, the worst is just poor pest control.
Yeah.
So if you've got vermin issues, those two are bringing salmonella in the facility. And then when we talk about rain events, oftentimes the source is what's on your roof, what's in your drain gutters and your downspouts. Because if you have birds roosting, they are making a daily deposit. And salmonella can survive for a long time. In a bird pat, when it rains, it gets washed either directly into the facility or around the facility and can gain access.
Yep. I remember there was a large recall of Cadbury chocolate in England at one of their plants. And it was exactly for that reason, is they had a drainage system that had a hole in a drain pipe from the roof, and it was over a product line. And during the investigation, as I watched this presentation at the Food Safety Summit, and kudos to Cadbury's for being very transparent and helping other people understand this, they also had a poultry processing facility that was not too far away from their plant. And so what's in your environment around your plant? What other type of manufacturers are there that could be vectors for bringing this into your facility too?
Yeah, I have another example where a water line leak was not at all obvious because the hole was a pinhole in that pipe.
Mm.
It wasn't dripping down, it was spritzing in an atomized mist. So there was really no visual evidence down below on equipment that that pipe was leaking.
Mm-hmm.
And it took somebody to get up on a human lift to go trace all the pipes that were overhead. And they just finally discovered that there was this one pipe that was just misting a little
Wow.
bit.
And as anybody who knows who investigates a micro issue in a facility, number one, right? There's nothing worse than a sporadic issue with a pathogen because your sample size just goes up and up and up and up, and it becomes very difficult to find. Ryan reminded me of something here as well. So this in a wet facility, if you're walking through, right, you're smacking somebody upside the head. Yeah, you see a sanitation guy with a power wand, like at the car wash, right? And they're hosing down the floor, and you get all this stuff, and just creating this massive aerosol, and it's just flying everywhere. What do they do in dry facilities? Compressed air hoses, right? And you'll walk in there, same thing. These guys have got these hoses going, right, and going in there and just blowing this stuff everywhere. What are they doing? All they're doing is seeding other areas of the facility. They're not helping in any way.
Yeah, agreed. Um, Vacuums kind of are the alternative.
Yeah.
And just think about your home vacuum cleaner and whether or not the expeller air coming out of that vacuum is held in proper sanitary condition. I mean, are these micron filters? Heck no. They're large particle size filters. So whatever you're sucking up can be easily blown out of that vacuum.
Oh yeah.
That's your typical collection.
Yeah, I've had those conversations. I'm sure people that are on the chat have as well, where just go down to Home Depot and buy some vacuums down there. We don't need these hermetic $10,000 vacuums that you get from Grainger or something like this. That's way too expensive. Just go get those other ones. Oh, big mistake.
Mm-hmm. The other bogeyman here that we haven't really spent much time on is how do you sanitize a dry facility?
Oh,
So I mentioned earlier that it's next to impossible to sanitize a dirty facility. So we're assuming now that you can get it clean. And then you're probably going to settle on an alcohol-based sanitizer
mhm.
because you apply it to a surface, it evaporates, you don't have any residual water on that surface that can cause microbial growth to occur. So these can be effective, but how do you apply them? Do you get a hand squirt bottle of
Mm.
propyl alcohol? Do you use a sanitary wipe? I don't know anybody that's doing flooding of an alcohol-based sanitizer on a dry piece of equipment.
Yeah.
So you're still left with spot sanitation of the areas that you can reach, that you can touch. But what about a conveyor belt gear assembly system? How do you
Yeah.
sanitize that?
Yeah. Is somebody standing there with a spray bottle while the belt run's going? Yeah, not very effective. Um, the other piece that we haven't talked about as well is if you're working in a dry, so think again back to this flour example where you have train loads of grains and things coming into your facility. Who's testing that? Do you have salmonella in the incoming raw materials? And how would you even go about testing such massive amounts of material?
Yeah, well, you don't. Number one, at least the industry doesn't. So I guess the bigger question, Brian, on this one is what's your supplier verification program look
Yeah.
like? And if you have an expectation that your supplier is going to provide you with pathogen-free dry materials, how do you verify that? A lot of people just rely on a letter of guarantee or a product spec sheet that says tested for salmonella, it was absent. How confident are you that that supplier actually did that test on that super sack of material you just received? Or was it something they did on a day's worth of production or a week's worth of production?
Right.
And if you are our energy bar, nutrition bar manufacturer, every single material that goes into that product is a high risk material.
Right.
So if you're putting nuts, for example, and oats, groats, for example, that may not have had a kill step in their process, I think just simply relying on a supplier letter of guarantee um, doesn't necessarily close the door to risk.
Nope. And so part of it too, a lot of times when you do an investigation on that size, you'll get the COA and it says salmonella negative. And then you actually talk to the supplier and say, okay, well, what test are you using? What sample size are you using? Are you doing composites? Are you doing FDA class 1 testing relative to this? You may find out that, oh no, we're testing 25 grams every 6 months out of millions of pounds of material. No, 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 right? There was a large non-fat dry milk recall a number of years ago. Where that's exactly what happened. Is they were testing like 25 grams out of a production day of hundreds of thousands of pounds, and FDA saw that and they're like, no, absolutely meaningless. Recall it all, and
Mhm.
that was a gigantic recall. Um, what about other novel type things that you hear out there that may work? So you hear about like um, dry ice cleaning, and things like this. What are your thoughts around that, Doug?
Well, you can dry clean using dry ice crystals, and the advantage of that is what you're trying to do is you're trying to use the friction of these dry ice crystals to use friction and force to scrape away material. The
Mhm.
advantage of dry ice is when it evaporates, it doesn't leave water. The disadvantage is when you are doing, let's say it's a vacuum tube, it reduces the temperature of that tube to a point where it may allow for water condensation inside the
Uh,
tube. So just be aware that it may be useful,
mhm.
but think about the conditions in which it's being used and whether or not condensation is a potential backlash.
Right.
You could use other inert materials, let's say salt. I've heard people use rice hulls.
Mm.
I don't even want to pretend to know what the microbiological condition of a rice hull is.
Yeah.
But again, so you're trying to use these materials to um, use frictional force to be able to get things that you can't get open clean. You could also use pigs. So these are either mechanical or pull pigs.
So not that big.
Not swine pigs, but these are insertion devices that you put into a tube and you pull it, or you mechanically convey it through the tube. And it's got a nice gasket that as it's going through, it's scraping off the tube. So those are some tools. Other tools that I've seen are people who advise using dry steam.
Mm.
I know that sounds a little like an oxymoron because steam basically is water. But the idea here is it's, high pressure, high temperature steam that it sublimes quickly after it touches the surface, so it doesn't, in theory, leave a water residue.
Mhm.
So those are tools that you can use to, scour away inherent material. In terms of sanitation, I've heard people use chlorine dioxide bombs,
Mhm.
folks who may install high intensity UV lamps to attempt to sanitize the air column. Um, High dose ozone is also something that I know is attractive to some folks. Just remember that high dose ozone is toxic to humans, so you wouldn't want to be running those while the facility is during during operation.
Yep.
So those are some tools of the trade. Um,
Hmm. Interesting. I mean, and so part of this too, right, is that, well, number one, if you're operating in a dry sanitation type environment, you probably in a lot of ways have very significant challenges you need to deal with. You cannot think that, this is cool, I'm in a dry facility, because part of this as well is FDA has demonstrated time and time again, Doug, that you cannot rely on the consumer to control your hazard. So think cookie dough, right? So the industry had made the argument that, hey, cookies are cooked, and in that kill step with the cooking in mom's kitchen, if there's any E. coli in there, it's gonna kill it. FDA said, no, 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 no. You cannot rely on the consumer to control the hazard. And oh, by the way, people eat raw cookie dough, and you know it, right? And so FDA completely slapped that down.
well, and this is one of the deficiencies in the current preventive controls for qualified individuals curriculum is when you do a hazard analysis, the expectation is you are considering hazards that are reasonably foreseeable.
Hmm.
And it doesn't talk about unintended use. It focuses on intended use of the product.
That's a good point.
And I think that's a bit of a gap in the instructional material. Later on in the course, there is one little statement that talks about unintended use, but it should be upfront and personal right when you're doing the hazard analysis. And when I teach the course, I always say, don't forget unintended use. And the cookie dough is an example. And I think Nessa in France pulled out of the frozen pizza market because
Yeah.
they hosted an outbreak in their frozen pizzas, and they just said, forget about it. We can't rely on the consumer to adequately cook a frozen pizza.
Absolutely. So we're almost out of time, Doug. So let's bring this back up to the 30,000 foot level. Any type of a summary you'd like to leave everybody with here today on this important topic?
Yeah, just if you're a dry clean operation or you have a portion of your operation that's dry clean, I would encourage you to have a plan of attack when you have a water intrusion event. Hopefully, that will never happen while you're in charge. But if it does, don't make it up after the fact. Make it up beforehand. Try it out. Make sure you know what's going to work. Make sure you know how you can adequately clean and sanitize equipment if you suspect that you've got a water intrusion event on that equipment, or you've got salmonella that could get on that equipment. So that's kind of my number one encouraging comment.
No, that's a great summary. And again, I think it's a very important point that we made in this conversation to add on to that is work with your organization and speak the language that the executives speak and show them the ROI associated with this, the return on investment of protecting your operations and making sure that you don't have a catastrophic event, because preparing that, which is what food safety is all about, is preparing and mitigating those strategies so that you're ready to go. So with that, we'll close out the chat for today. Coming up here, and I'll put some more information on LinkedIn on this as well. So with these chats, I put together a database of these chats so that you can go back and reference this material, because we're very aware that putting together an hour of your time once a week is a serious investment. And a lot of times people are traveling and aren't able to do it. And I get comments all the time, Doug, back of, where can I find? I missed that conversation with Doug on dry cleaning. Oh, I need to watch that. Where can I watch that? So the good news is I've put together all this information, and there's more going to be coming on that. And so stay tuned. We're here with the chat, and we'll be getting you more of that stuff. Anything coming up in your near future, Doug? Any webinars or things you'd like to let people know about? Or
let's see, not so much on the webinar plan, but I am going to be at the American Spice Trade Association next week talking about validating kill steps. So if anybody wants more information on that particular topic, just ping me and we can have a conversation.
Yep, so, his email is right there. So with that, guys, we'll bring our chat to a close for this week. A fantastic one, man. It's tons of things to think about here. And to Doug's point earlier, we're up against an adversary that's going to figure out a way to get to us in some way. So we need to be ahead of the curve and make sure that we're covering those things. So thanks again for joining us for the chat for this week. We'll be back here next week at the same time. So 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter for our next live stream, where I'll bring another amazing guest like Doug onto the show. So thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Enjoy yourself, and we'll see you back here next week. Thanks, everybody.